Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to my talk this afternoon, and thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank first and foremost Dr. Patricia Kieran and everyone at the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies for kindly inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to share with you my research, the title of which is Beyond Wellbeing, Exploring the Relationships Between Psychological Wellbeing, Religiosity and Religious Coping amongst adolescents at senior cycle level in post-primary schools in Ireland. And this research was conducted as part of my doctorate under the expert supervision of Drs. Maurice Harmon and Dr. Trevor O'Brien here at Mary Immaculate College. So I firstly like to start by setting the context and speaking a little bit about what psychology has to say about religion in terms of theoretical perspectives. So this psychological theory of human development is Engel's 1977 biopsychosocial model. And what this theory purports is that human experience can be understood from three different perspectives. The first is the biological perspective, and this encompasses our genetics, our health. The psychological perspective, looking at things like our cognition, our cognitive ability, social skills, self-esteem and mental health. And then the social perspective, and this looks at things like our family and peer relationships. So what this theory kind of purports is that human experience can be understood from these three different perspectives. So the biological, the psychological, and the social perspectives. This is a very famous theory in the realm of psychology. But some of you listening may be thinking, this theory is a little bit limiting because it leaves out the spiritual dimension. That spiritual dimension that we're aware encompasses, I suppose, all of our experiences as human beings. So in recent times, theorists have started to kind of reconceptualize some of these older psychological theories to bring in this idea that there is a spiritual dimension to our human experience. So Fisher in 2021, he reconceptualized the biopsychosocial theory, and he talks more about the biopsychosocial and spiritual perspectives on human experience and development. So we can see here we have still our biological dimension, psychological dimension, social dimension, but he's also added in this spiritual dimension to our human experience. And this encompasses things like faith, spiritual experiences, and entering into higher levels of consciousness. So that's just one theory that's kind of been revamped in recent times to, I suppose, bring in that spiritual dimension of our human experience. Another theory that you're probably all very familiar with is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is a very nice kind of hierarchical theory, and it gives a very kind of nice staged approach to our experience as humans. What it tells us is that we can't, I suppose, self-actualize, or we can't, reach our career goals, our relationship goals, until we've met kind of our more basic needs, like, food, warmth, and security. So the pinnacle of human experience, as per this theory from 1943, is this idea of self-actualization. And self-actualization, as per the theory, is achieving one's potential. And this is often in relation to creative pursuits. However, Maslow, towards the end of his life, a lot of people are unaware that he became a little bit dissatisfied with his explanation of human experience, and his later writings started to talk about the idea of self-transcendence as being the pinnacle of human experience. So Maslow's revised hierarchy of needs puts at the pinnacle of our human experience this idea of self-transcendence, or moving beyond ourselves into something more. And this again is where that spiritual dimension comes in for individuals. So what does this all tell us? So it tells us that some psychologists and researchers are beginning to recognise from a theoretical perspective that there is a spiritual dimension to our experience as human beings. And therefore this should be considered in our research, in our policy, and within our practice as well. So some key concepts that I'm going to just introduce to you that I'm going to be talking about over the course of today. Psychological well-being, religiosity, and religious coping. And I'll talk a little bit now about what each of these mean as per my empirical study. So the first key concept is religiosity. This term has been used in the literature interchangeably with the term religiousness. So that suggests that there exists a spectrum whereby someone can be more or less religious. How is religiosity defined? How do we demonstrate it? Well, it's demonstrated through religious belonging, religious practice, and religious belief, and it's tied into particular faith traditions. So we see here the three components of religiosity: identifying or self-affiliating as being belonging to a particular tradition, believing in the beliefs set out by that faith tradition, and then actually practicing in line with the expectations of that tradition. And religiosity can be either intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. And what that means is an individual who might be intrinsically motivated to practice their religion, they've really internalised and they really, I suppose, buy into their religious beliefs. They're very intrinsically motivated to practice them. Those who are extrinsically religious, they are the ones who might practice their religion because it brings them maybe some sort of social benefits. So it's something outside of themselves that's motivating them to actually be religious. The second key concept is the idea of religious coping. And this refers to how people actually use their religion in order to comprehend and to deal with daily life. So religious coping can be either positive or negative in nature. And positive religious coping refers to positively using our religion to cope with daily life. This can look like practicing religious forgiveness or religious gratitude, using religion to comprehend our life events positively, so thinking about things like God or higher power having a plan for me, and that's why something negative might be happening, reading the Bible for strength, and so forth. So those positive elements of religion and using them to comprehend our life in a positive way. Negative religious coping then is the maladaptive use of religion in order to cope with daily life. For example, this can be questioning the power of God, feeling angry towards God, and perhaps perceiving negative life events that might occur as a result of God or divine power actually punishing us. Negative religious coping strategies are considered maladaptive in nature. We'll talk more about the implications for both of those coping methods for mental health and well-being shortly. And the last key concept that I want to talk to you about today is psychological well-being. And psychological well-being within this study, it's conceptualised as part of our overall mental health. And as per Riff's theory of psychological well-being and mental health, it's a very famous theory and a very well-accepted theory within the literature. It suggests that mental health is comprised of a number of facets, and that is psychological well-being, emotional well-being, and social well-being. And altogether then, they form our mental health. Psychological well-being itself then is comprised of a number of elements of optimal psychological functioning, as we'll see here on the diagram. So these include a sense of autonomy, or feeling that we are autonomous in our lives, self-acceptance, personal growth, feeling that we're able to grow and develop and reach our goals, holding positive relations with other people, a sense of mastery over our environment, that we feel we're able to succeed well in the environments that we're in, whether that be home or school, and a sense of purpose or meaning in life. So all of those together are conceptualised as comprising our psychological well-being. And that term psychological well-being is used interchangeably with mental well-being. Okay, so looking at some background and what the international research in the area has to say about the relationship between psychology and religion. So what it tells us in terms of adults is that religiosity and positive religious coping are associated with a range of positive outcomes for adults' mental health and well-being. And conversely then, some other studies have shown that religiosity and negative religious coping methods, that they're associated with negative outcomes for our psychological well-being as adults. However, the relationship between religion and mental well-being amongst an adolescent population has been relatively understudied in the international context. So my research had two stages, and the first one was a systematic review of the literature, and the second was an actual empirical study. So I'll talk briefly about the systematic literature review and why that led me on to actually completing the empirical study that I did. So the systematic literature review had one review question. So this was what I aimed to investigate as part of the review. And the question was, what is the relationship between mental health and religiosity amongst adolescents? and this was within an international context. So within my search of the literature, I searched across 7 different databases, and I included key search terms that pertained to mental health and religiosity amongst adolescents and young people. I then employed inclusion and exclusion criteria, which helped me to decide which studies I was actually going to include or exclude from the review. And at the end, I ended up with 10 studies, which I actually looked at for the systematic literature review. In total, the participants within those studies amounted to 39,796, and they were all adolescents aged between 11 and 20. The locations of the studies varied, so we had studies from Kuwait, a study from Lebanon, the United States, England and Wales, Zambia, Poland and Austria, and notably there were no studies available looking at the relationship between mental health and religiosity within the Irish context. So what were the overall findings of that review? So for the majority of participants, so those were the adolescents internationally, religion was associated with enhanced sense of purpose in life, greater levels of happiness, more positive affect, and also higher self-esteem and satisfaction with life. So a range of positive outcomes. However, religiosity was also found to have some negative implications for adolescents' mental health, and those included lower levels of happiness and a greater likelihood of experiencing depressive symptoms. So there was a complex relationship really within the literature, with some, I suppose, positive results noted and some negative findings as well. And they also found, some studies found that religiosity had a mitigating effect against anxiety and depression, whereas others then found that the types of religious attitudes we hold, or that adolescents hold, that they can actually have positive or negative ramifications for mental health, depending on the types of attitudes they were. So that was a brief summary of the findings of the systematic literature review, and again, that was adolescents in the international context. So that led me on then to my own empirical study that I conducted, and the title of which is Exploring the Relationship Between Psychological Wellbeing, Religiosity and Religious Coping amongst Adolescents at Senior Cycle Level in Post-Primary Schools in Ireland. So the background to the empirical study and why I went ahead and completed it. So following my systematic review of the literature, I ascertained that there was no previously published research which investigated the relationship between religion and well-being amongst an adolescent population attending post-primary schools in Ireland. And despite this, the potential for religion to actually influence student well-being is presented across a lot of key documentation from the Department of Education, some of which are on screen currently. So the Wellbeing Policy Statement and Framework for Practice, the Junior Cycle Wellbeing Guidelines from 2021, the Framework for Junior Cycle in 2015, and the new Draft Primary Curriculum Framework. So all of these documents actually purport the idea that religion is linked to student well-being. But despite this, there's no actual evidence thus far in relation to that in terms of empirical studies backing up that claim within the Irish context. International research then, so from my systematic literature review, it saw that that research actually focused just on the relationship between religiosity and well-being, and it didn't actually look at how exactly religion can influence student well-being. For example, through looking at a concept like religious coping to see how adolescents actually use religion and how that might impact on well-being. And finally, international research employed just quantitative means to look at that area. So despite the relative secularisation of Irish society in recent years, religion still remains part of the lives of many adolescents here, and it can be, I suppose, an influence across a variety of systems that adolescents are part of. And this ties into Bronfman Brenner's ecological systems theory, which was the overall psychological theory underpinning this study. We can see here in this adapted illustrated model from Stanger and the Department of Education and Skills in 2018 that religion can actually influence the life of an adolescent and their overall well-being within their individual system, so through their own individual relationship with their faith tradition, if applicable, through their school, which again might be a denominational school with a religious culture, and the various religious systems and religious influences on our society today. As well as that, there's no previously peer-reviewed research investigating the relationship between religion and mental health among students attending post-primary schools in this country. So the key aims of my empirical study, therefore, were firstly to address that dearth in the research between the relationships between students' wellbeing and their religion in Ireland. Then to explore how religion exactly can potentially impact the wellbeing of religion, or the wellbeing of students, through examination of the use of religious coping methods among students. And finally, to include the voice of young people holistically within the research through use of qualitative methods. So my 3 research questions were as follows. Firstly, what is the relationship between psychological wellbeing and religiosity amongst students attending post-primary schools at senior cycle level in Ireland? Secondly, to look at the relationship between psychological wellbeing and positive religious coping amongst that population. And then to examine the relationship between psychological wellbeing and negative religious coping amongst students attending post-primary schools at senior cycle level in this country. So my sample was as follows. My participants were adolescent students at senior cycle level across 10 different post-primary schools within the Irish context. And 6 of those schools were denominational Catholic post-primary schools and 4 were multi-denominational schools. I had 110 participants take part in the quantitative element of my study and 7 participants then took part in the qualitative element. And I should mention that participants were at senior cycle level in Irish post-primary schools, so they were those at transition year, 5th year or leaving certificate level. Due to the COVID-19 related school closures that were in place at the time, data were collected solely online for the purposes of my study. So the measures that I used to gather my data were as follows. In terms of measuring student psychological wellbeing, I used RIF's 18-item measure, his 18-item scales of psychological wellbeing, and we'll have a quick look at that measure in a moment. Religiosity then was operationalised through use of a 9-item measure, which had been previously used in the Irish context by a number of researchers. Religious coping was operationalised through use of a 14-item measure, the brief RCOPE, which is a very well-known measure of religious coping. Demographic information then was also recorded, and I used semi-structured interviews to obtain the viewpoints of adolescents on the potential relationships between religion and well-being. So this is the measure of psychological well-being that students would have completed as part of my study. This is just a quick excerpt from it, but students had to indicate to what degree they agreed or disagreed with the number of statements, so 18 in total. And they all pertain to different elements of the students' overall psychological well-being. So some of them looked at their sense of autonomy, some looked at purpose in life, and so forth. For example, the first one here, I like most parts of my personality, and the student had to indicate to what degree they agreed or disagreed with that statement. The second measure then was the one of religiosity, as per Byrne et al. And McGrady et al. In 2019. I divided them here into 3 sections, looking at religious belonging, belief and practice, which, as we know already, is what religiosity is conceptualised as being part of. So we can see here questions like, what is your religious affiliation? And students would have had to indicate that. They would have looked at their religious beliefs, so indicating to what degree they believed in certain statements such as, I believe in God. And then practice, so for example, in terms of religious attendance and personal prayer, how often do they engage with those elements of religious practice? The next measure then is the brief RCOPE, so this is looking at the student's sense of religious coping. And it's kind of divided into 2 sections, so looking at positive religious coping methods and their use, and negative religious coping. And the student is asked to indicate over the last while how often they've kind of used these religious coping techniques. So for example, a positive religious coping method was looking for a stronger connection with God, and then perhaps a negative religious coping one would be questioning God's love for me. And they had to indicate to what degree they had been engaging in those coping methods over the last while. And finally, this is the interview schedule that I used to conduct the semi-structured interviews with the students. As you can see, they had a number of questions and they were asked to expand as much or as little as they wished on these questions. So the length of the actual interviews varied depending on how much the students actually wanted to talk. So some talked for about 5 minutes, some for 15-20 minutes. They had a number of questions pertaining to how religion influences their life, if they believe it has any impact on their well-being, and then they were asked to kind of consider whether they believe there's an overall role for religion in the well-being of young people in Ireland today. So I analysed my data, my quantitative data, using SPSS, so through some descriptive statistics and then inferential ones as well. So I looked at correlation, comparative analyses and regression analyses using SPSS. And my qualitative data I analysed through use of reflexive thematic analysis from the critical realist perspective. So the critical realist philosophical paradigm was the one that was kind of underpinning my study. So that's why I approached the analysis from that perspective. So just briefly in looking at the demographic information of who took part in my study. Within the surveys, we can see here as per the diagram on screen, I had 110 participants who took part in the surveys, 61 of whom were female and 49 were male. In terms of what class level they were at, there were 34 at 5th year level, 27 in TY and 49 in leaving certificate classes. And then in terms of religious affiliation, we had 80 participants who identified as Catholic, 9 who identified as atheist, 9 stated they didn't know, 7 self-affiliated as being agnostic, 4 as Protestant and 1 as pagan. Looking then at the demographics in terms of interview participants, there were 5 females who took part and 2 males, 6 self-identified as Catholic and 1 said they didn't know. So just briefly looking at the results in terms of religious beliefs, because this informs, I suppose, where I went next with my analysis. 80 out of the 110 participants defined as being Catholic, so that was a strong majority of participants who self-affiliated as Catholic. However, 25 of these participants then did not actually profess a belief in God, which, as many of us know, will be one of the main, I suppose, tenets of religious belief in the Catholic faith. So in order to facilitate analysis between theist participants, so those who professed a belief in God, and non-theists, those who didn't profess belief in God, I split the data file. So this was done in previous research in the Irish context, which looked at the religious beliefs of participants as well. So what I ended up with was 55 participants who defined as theists, based on their answer to the question, I believe in God, and to what degree they agreed with that. And 55 participants were defined as non-theists then, based on their response to that question. So it was an even split within the data file. So then looking at my key findings in terms of the quantitative element of the study. So the first research question was looking at psychological well-being and its overall relationship with religiosity. So what I found was no significant overall quantitative association or relationship between overall psychological well-being and students' religiosity. However, within that, religious beliefs was a predictor of psychological well-being for theist participants. So what that meant was that those students who were defined as theists, who believed in God, when we considered their other religious beliefs, the more, I suppose, strongly held they were, the better predictor it was of better outcomes or better overall psychological well-being. The second research question then was looking at psychological well-being and positive religious coping. So what we found again was that there was no significant overall quantitative relationship between psychological well-being and the use of positive religious coping methods. However, when we investigated it further, there was a significant positive correlation between positive religious coping and purpose in life. So when students used positive religious coping, their sense of purpose in life tended to go up as well. And the final research question was looking at the relationship between psychological well-being and negative religious coping. And what we found was that greater use of negative religious coping methods predicted lower overall psychological well-being. And interestingly, this was the same for both theist participants and non-theist participants. So individuals who defined as not actually being religiously affiliated at all, they were just as likely as their religiously affiliated peers to actually use negative religious coping. And this in turn had a negative impact on their overall psychological well-being. Then looking at the results of the interview data, so the reflexive thematic analysis. So these were organised under 4 different themes. And the first one is just looking at mental well-being and religiosity, and maps onto that first question there in terms of what is the relationship between religiosity, so that sense of belonging, believing and practicing to a particular faith, and overall mental well-being. And I've just put together a number of quotations from the students themselves in terms of their idea of the relationship between these variables. So one student felt that their religion or the religiosity helped their mental well-being because you have a connection with God, because you feel that that you have something special and that you are someone special to God, and that's really helpful. Another student then said, I think you can't have a good mental well-being, a good mental health, without being grounded in your own faith and knowing what you believe in and why you believe in it. Building on that then, another student said, I think it definitely helps me with experiences. Like if I'm nervous about something, or if something's kind of going on, it's like a person that's there, that doesn't necessarily have to answer or judge me. I can just kind of say these things and feel like they're in the hands of someone else. And finally, in relation to this theme, a student said, if I ever have a problem, like if it was coming up to exams and I feel like I need a little bit of help, I can just, it's always there. I kind of feel like someone is looking after me, I guess. The second theme then was looking at mental well-being and religious coping, so how they actually used their religion to cope with their life. One student said, my religion kind of helps me stay grounded and, not get really flustered or overwhelmed. I think praying is the main thing. If I'm having a very stressful day or just kind of feeling a bit overwhelmed, I can just kind of sit down and relax and pray. Building on that then, similarly, another student said, I can just say the rosary and it kind of calms me down in the sense that I'm not as worried. Another student said, it allows me to explain some of the things I'm going through faith-based stuff, and confession is also really helpful to get things off my chest and clear my conscience. And another student, if something bad happens, I have a feeling that I know that it's happening for a reason, that bad things don't just happen for no good reason, that God is there and that He has a plan, and that something even worse could be happening. So we see from this interview data the students using their religion to positively cope with life, for example, through use of personal prayer, through use of a Catholic student there using the sacraments, and also using their religion to, positively comprehend life. Still on the same theme here, looking at mental well-being and religious coping. This is a very powerful quote from a student who experienced bereavement during the COVID-19 lockdowns, and she talks very candidly about how her religion helped her through that time. So she said, without religion, I don't think that I would have been able to cope with the whole lockdown, and then when you lose someone. I think without religion and without being able to kind of have God as this person to come to, and be able to believe that my granddad is gone somewhere better, I don't think I would have been able to cope without religion. Yeah, it definitely gets me through the tough times. So again, you can see there she's using her religion to positively comprehend that negative life event that's happened to her, really in terms of the lockdown and also the passing of her granddad. Moving on to the next theme then, and looking at positive relations with others and religion. And we know that positive relations with others is a component of psychological well-being, but it was a really strong trend that came up again and again through my data. One student said that their religion kind of helps me make friends as well, which is good for my well-being. Kind of being social and active with people, both my age and other ages around the parish, that I can meet people who feel either the same or differently about religion, and we can kind of talk about it. Another student said, not only is it many of the people in the community, but also many of the priests in my local parish are very helpful and kind. And very simply then, one student said, religion helps me to be more compassionate with people. So we can see there from that data the way that students of religion can actually contribute to having more positive relations with others, particularly within their religious community. And the final theme then was looking at religion and the well-being of young people in Ireland, or adolescents in Ireland, in terms of looking at the past, the present, and potential future directions. So when asked about whether they believe that religion still has a role to play in the lives of young people and in their well-being in Ireland, one student said, not really, because it's not as common anymore for young people to actually practice their religion. Another student felt differently then. They said, I know plenty of people, a lot of my friends actually, who would say the same as me, that religion has a massive role in their lives, in moving them forward and also part of their identity. When asked then if they'd be open to religion being part of a wellbeing class in school, or if there'd be any elements of religious practice that they'd like to see worked into wellbeing for religious students, all students were open to this. However, they were very strong that it was just students who were religious or interested who would take part in those activities. So when they thought about what might be helpful in terms of a wellbeing class, they said, speaking about your feelings, like you do in religion when you're praying, I think that would be a very nice thing to have in a wellbeing class. Another student said, talking about getting in touch with God. And finally, one student said prayer, and what you can say to help yourself. And just like talking about the different places you can turn to, like whether that's going to light a candle or kneeling down and saying the rosary. And again, you can see there the types of positive religious coping popping up there, like personal prayer and having a relationship with God or higher power as well, that students would like to see within wellbeing classes. So my overall findings showed that there's a complex relationship really between religion and wellbeing amongst adolescents at senior cycle level in post-primary schools in Ireland. So for religiously affiliated adolescents, their religion has the potential to impact positively on their overall psychological well-being, but this is provided that the religious coping methods they use are positive in nature. And really interestingly as well, for both religiously affiliated and unaffiliated adolescents, the use of negative religious coping methods has the potential to contribute to lower overall psychological well-being. And finally, it seems that the more intrinsic and genuinely held an adolescent's religious beliefs are, if they are religious, this is more likely then to contribute to better overall psychological well-being for them. So the limitations of my study must be acknowledged. Firstly, in terms of sample size, there was a relatively small sample size in my study, so future research tried to expand on this by broadening the amount of students that are taken into consideration in the data. Also, there was a striking lack of diversity in the sample. There was, while this is, I suppose, a common trend in the literature, females are more likely to take part in research than males. There were more females than males in this study, so it's likely then that the results are more generalisable to female adolescents than to male adolescents. And even more pertinent really is looking at the absent voice within my research. We know from looking at the demographic information, 80 out of the 110 participants self-identified as Catholic. There was a small minority identified as atheist, agnostic, but the minority world religions were completely missing from this data. So really future research needs to build on that and try to get the views of those absent voices, the students who are religiously unaffiliated and the students from minority world religions as well, to look at their feelings and their perspectives on the relationship between their religion or lack thereof and their overall well-being. The use of communion sampling was also a significant limitation of the data. It impacts on its generalisability across the population and also the generalisability of the measures used. So I presented the ones on screen. This is particularly in relation to the religiosity and the religious coping measure. These were written from a predominantly Christian worldview and would have been potentially off-putting for students who didn't identify as religious or perhaps identified with a world religion, and they might have felt that these measures weren't, I suppose, representative of their beliefs, or they couldn't maybe identify with them. So that may have led to some dropout in my research. Again, we can't prove that, but it's something that needs to be considered in the future. What type of measures to use and what language to use within those measures to see, to make sure, I suppose, that all potential participants are included within the data collection. So what are the overall implications of the findings for practice, for research and for policy? Firstly, in terms of future research, and I've mentioned a bit of this already, but really future research in the area should have a larger, more diverse sample, and a longitudinal design would also be really helpful in terms of seeing how, I suppose, students' religious beliefs, belonging and practice kind of changes over time and how this impacts on their well-being. The perspectives of psychologists in the area, I completed this research as part of a doctorate in educational and child psychology, so I suppose thinking about how actually psychologists feel about intervening and working in this area, and if they feel equipped to do so. It would be really nice to see joint research, and even to see, I suppose, someone with a theology background or a spirituality background, even a spiritual leader, looking at data like this, because obviously I'm coming from the psychological perspective, and I think, you know, viewing data like mine or similar research through a different lens might kind of add that spiritual dimension to the data and might add some kind of spiritual explanations for maybe some of the trends and some of the findings of my data. In terms of policy then, the findings of this research, they support the inclusion of reference to positive and negative religious coping in wellbeing and religious education curricula and guidance, and critical incident response guidance as well for schools and psychologists, and the potential ramifications of the use of positive and negative religious coping for adolescents' overall mental well-being. For adolescents themselves then, the findings might help to enhance their own understanding of the potential relationship between positive religious coping and negative religious coping and their overall psychological well-being, and might help them to kind of question, what are they using? What type of coping methods are they actually using? And do I think this might have a bearing on my mental well-being? For psychologists then, it's important to consider the findings of this research and to potentially acknowledge the spiritual dimension that can be impacting on adolescents in terms of their mental well-being. I'm in touch with a psychologist based in Dublin who does this in her practice, and she tries to differentiate, I suppose, between psychological difficulties and maybe spiritual difficulties, and recognising that there are some difficulties that, I suppose, go beyond the realm of psychology. Assessment then, so it might impact psychologists' intake assessment. So with an adolescent who might be struggling with mental well-being, it might be useful to ask them, are they religious? Do they have any religious affiliation? Do they practice a religion? And then to do some assessment, if they are, on their use of positive and negative religious coping. And this then will feed into psychologists' formulations, their idea of why an adolescent might be presenting with mental well-being issues. And depending on the type of religious coping methods used by the adolescent, it might be that their religion is actually a protective factor, that it might be helpful in terms of their mental well-being. But if they're using negative religious coping, it may be actually a risk factor in terms of their mental health. Intervention then, psychologists should consider challenging the use of negative religious coping if they see it, and also to reaffirm the use of positive religious coping as well. So that psychologist that I spoke about earlier, she does this a lot in her own practice in terms of, she told me a case of a man who was coming to see her and was saying that he was finding life very difficult, but actually when he practiced his religion in a certain way, I believe it was attending mass, that he found a great peace. And he said to her, would I be, crazy to keep practicing this if it's helping me? And she said, no, not at all. So she encouraged that. She reaffirmed that positive religious coping with that client. Training then, in terms of providing training on well-being and well-being support for adolescents, for the teachers and parents of adolescents, to include content on religious coping in that well-being promotion training. And again, the potential ramifications of positive religious coping use and negative religious coping use as well. And in terms of critical incidents, responding to critical incidents in terms of highlighting the implications again of positive and negative religious coping in terms of dealing with those adverse events that may arise in schools. For school staff then, the findings of the study, they support the inclusion of religious elements within whole school wellbeing promotion, and this is for students who are religiously affiliated or interested only. For example, this might look like facilitating guided religious meditation for Catholic students at whole school assemblies. Practicing use of positive religious coping methods during religious education lessons would also be helpful. So for example, reading of the Bible for strength, personal prayer, guided religious meditation, practicing religious gratitude and forgiveness. Teaching students about positive and negative religious coping and the potential benefits or negative effects of using these methods when dealing with life events in SPHE and wellbeing lessons. And it would be, I suppose, beneficial for all students to hear this, even if they aren't affiliated with a religion, because we know from this data that students who are religiously unaffiliated are actually tending to use negative religious coping, and this is associated with lower overall psychological well-being. Supporting students then to use their religion to positively comprehend life experiences, and again to challenge the use of negative religious coping if they see it arise during school. And finally then looking at the implications of the findings of this study for practice within religious communities. So firstly, as we're here at the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies, I try to think of these, I suppose, with through the Catholic lens and what that might look like. So aiming to develop young people's intrinsic religiosity is really important for religious communities, not just Catholic religious communities, but thinking about how exactly they can help students to actually buy into their faith. Because this, as we know, the more intrinsic, the more strongly held an individual's religious beliefs are, the more likely it is to contribute to better overall psychological well-being. And thinking about helping them to internalise their religious beliefs so that they're not just practising because, you know, my parents do or whatever, but thinking about how you can actually get them actively involved. For example, through religious youth groups, initiatives, for example, like the John Paul II Award, practicing the sacraments, like that student mentioned, was very beneficial for his mental well-being as well. Again, to support children and young people within religious communities to use positive religious coping, and again, this might be through their involvement in a religious youth group or even preparation for the sacraments, and to use their religion to positively comprehend life experiences. And finally, to challenge that use of negative religious coping if it is obvious, if it is apparent. So I'd like to thank you all so much for listening to my presentation. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you today, and I welcome any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you.